Okay, so this is like a little review of the key studies that you're going to need to know to be able to answer questions in the childhood section. In order to get a good grade on any assessed work, 10 mark or 20 mark questions, you really need to be using sociologists and key concepts. So this will take you through the main ones that you would need to know and the main ones that you would really need to include in those answers. Okay, so first up, remember childhood is a social construction. It varies over time and place. So you need to know some examples of that. A good one is Punch's study. Sam Punch did studies of children in Bolivia and argued that on her research, children in Bolivia took on much more responsibility than children tend to in the United Kingdom. And as a result, it shows that cultural variations, differences in culture, affect what childhood is like. Children there acting much more as we would perceive adults act. Likewise, historical differences. You've got Philip Aries, who in Centuries of Childhood argued that childhood is a relatively recent construction, the way we currently see children as being different, separate, innocent. He argued that in medieval Europe, childhood didn't exist. Children were very much just little adults, and they were treated like that. They dressed like adults. They often behaved like adults. He argued that, he said childhood, the history of childhood is a nightmare from which we've only just woken, and argued that we now have moved towards a child-centered society, what he called a modern cult of childhood, where children are at the heart of modern society. He found all of this out by examining texts and paintings of children throughout the times, and he argued that that showed childhood didn't exist. However, other people have questioned the validity of that research, given that obviously paintings, documents don't necessarily portray the reality of what childhood was like. You can also add other sociologists like Shorter, who argued that obviously this makes sense given infant mortality rates were so high in medieval Europe. For instance, children were often not named until they were 2 or 3 years old, once the parents were sure they'd get through infancy, and this sort of showed a different attitude towards children that would have been around at that time. Okay, so those are all the sort of march of progress views. We also have other sociologists that argue that maybe childhood did improve, but now it's getting worse again. The classic example of this is Neil Postman's Disappearance of Childhood. He argues that yes, for a long period of time childhood didn't exist, then it did, and now it's disappearing again at a, quote, dazzling speed. He argues that this is because the classic information hierarchy, where parents know stuff, children don't, this keeps children innocent and ignorant, has been destroyed by TV and more recently the internet. Children are able to access information about sex and crime and all the nastier parts of society, and that this has destroyed classic childhood. Jenks takes looks sort of from a postmodernist perspective. He disagrees with Postman, says that childhood isn't disappeared at all. He argues postmodern society generates massive feelings of insecurity. Postmodern society is all about rapid change and people not really knowing from one day to the next what's going on. This creates insecurity in adults, and as a result, children have become an important source of identity for adults. A lot of adults sort of view the quality of their life through their children, and that's evident from the amount that parents talk about their children and put children at the centre of their lives. He argues that parents have become much more protective over children, so rather than just sticking them in front of the TV, like Postman argued, allowing all that innocence to be taken away, parents are stopping children leaving the house because they're worried something terrible will happen to them. So Jenks argues, in some respects, children are much more like friends in postmodern society as well to parents. He also ties this in with divorce and the impact that that's had on the relationships between adults and children. Someone else who takes a sort of fairly negative view of modern childhood is Sue Palmer. She wrote a book about toxic childhood, who argues that the technological and cultural changes of the last 25 years have damaged children massively. Children are far less likely to go outside, far more likely to be stuck in front of a screen, either a computer or a TV or phones. Children spend most of their time staring into screens, and this is damaging them both physically and mentally. She talks about the diet of children changing as well, eating junk food far more than they used to. This is leading to massive levels of obesity in children and mental illness such as depression and anxiety. And she argues that what we've created, often because we're trying to protect children, we don't want children to go outside because we're worried, the world out there is dangerous and it's full of paedophiles, and therefore we're going to keep all the children inside and stick them in front of a TV. But this is making children massively anxious, massively sad, and overweight. So she argues that our current attitude towards children is toxic. Some other things that you need to know, less sort of sociologists for this, but more just concepts that you need to be able to talk about, is the fact that we talk about childhood as if it's one thing, but there are lots and lots of factors that affect childhood, and there are differences between children based on things like their culture, social class, gender, and ethnicity. So, for instance, this is where you could tie in what you've learnt in education. We know that parents tend to treat boys and girls differently. Boys are allowed out and are given greater freedoms than girls. Girls, therefore, create more of a bedroom culture with their friends. This will affect their experience of childhood. Social class-wise, we know that childhood is probably considerably a happier time if you're middle class. We know working class children are more likely to live in suboptimal housing conditions that have damp. This is more likely to create illness. They're more likely to worry about money. They're more likely to be aware of money, how much their parents earn, and the fact that they can't do things that certainly middle class children don't have to worry about. And therefore, probably, middle-class children do enjoy more innocence than the working class. Equally, cultural and ethnic differences, there are, and this is often tied to gender as well. In certain cultural backgrounds, females are treated massively differently than males. Classically, and in the text, we talk about this being an issue in the Muslim community, that Muslim male boys are given much greater freedoms than females. There is also a group of sociologists who take a conflict view of childhood, who say that the inequalities between adults and children are artificial and not good for children. A classic example of this is Shulamith Firestone, who wrote The Myth of Childhood. And she argues that children today experience much greater control and oppression than they did in the past. That childhood ignorance is artificial and is often done more for the benefit of parents than for kids. We lie to children, not just about Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy, but about all sorts of things. And she argues that this is actually unnecessary. And classically in her book, she argues if we are trying to protect children from the horrors of the adult world, then maybe we should make the adult world a less horrible place rather than just lie to children. Another one who takes a conflict view is Diana Gittins, who talks about age patriarchy. She argues that if childhood was so wonderful, why are so many children desperate to escape it? She argues the concept of patriarchy, which classically is obviously males oppressing females and using male dominance. She argues that males also oppress entire families, that children are subject to the same patriarchal structures, and that all children suffer patriarchy at the hands of the male in the house. She says this is evident, as I say, because children want to escape it. She says that children use different strategies to escape the oppression. Some children act down, as she said, and they become more childlike, more babyish. She says that this is a strategy used by children, or they act up, like these two little tykes here in the picture, smoking fags and pretending they're older than what they are. Finally, the last sociologist that you could include is Carol Smart. You might remember her from the personal life perspective. She talks about the new sociology of childhood. This is an excellent point to put in a conclusion for a 20-mark essay if you want to get some extra evaluation. She argues that traditionally, when we look at childhood, we consider children just from the viewpoint of adults. All of those theories that we've just talked about are adults sort of talking about children and what it's like for them. And classically, adults see children as sort of, quote, socialization projects, things to shape and mold to turn into the thing that you want them to be. She argues that actually if you talk to children and we focus sociology of children on what children actually say, we realise that children play a much more active role in shaping their world. They often decide their family relationships and who is important to them and all of that sort of thing. And she crucially also points out that children are all different. We shouldn't talk about childhood as one homogenous thing, but, there are girl childhoods and boy childhoods and Chinese childhoods and working class childhoods, and all of these things need to be taken into account. We need to stop talking about it as one thing. Okay, so they are the key studies and the key sociologists that you need to know for this module. You need to make sure that you know them all. I would make cue cards for them with their key points, also any evaluation points, which you'll be able to find in the text. Because these are the kind of points that you're going to structure paragraphs around, either in 10-mark or 20-mark questions.